Hello everyone. Welcome or welcome back. Thank you for clicking on this video in a very saturated content market. I feel honored and I feel committed to providing value to you in this video. So hopefully I can do that. So for those of you who don't know, I'm Sam and I converted to Mormonism when I was 16 years old and I deconverted from Mormonism when I was 22 years old. And in that time, I got a bachelor's degree from BYU, Idaho, which is probably the most Mormon place on the planet. And I also lived in Provo and Logan, which are two more of the most Mormon places on the planet. I also spent my first couple of years as a Mormon in England, which is obviously quite a different Mormon environment, as England is a very secular country. So naturally, church culture has some pretty significant differences from areas like Utah, where Mormonism is the dominant belief. That being said, what I found in every single one of those places, in dozens of wards, and what I want to discuss in this video, is that Mormonism has a big superiority complex problem, which to me seems to be quite clearly a feature rather than a bug of the religion. And that superiority complex will often limit believers' ability to empathize with people who are different from them, which I think is the main reason it's important to talk about. Obviously, this isn't always the case. I know a number of incredibly empathetic LDS people, but it is a trend I've seen that is supported by the teachings of the church and that I myself experienced during my time in Mormonism. I was annoying. I also think this is important to talk about just because, in my opinion, lessening the power our egos have over us is a really key part of having sort of a healthy, helpful spirituality that's centered around empathy for ourselves and others, but we will get to that. So when I was learning about Mormonism from the missionaries, they taught me this metaphor. Basically, they taught me that once upon a time, the earth had the fullness of the gospel, and it was like this unbroken mirror. And then I think they said when Christ died, I feel like I'm forgetting something I should know about Mormon doctrine right now. Anyway, the mirror got smashed basically, and all different people started picking up different pieces of the mirror. And so they could see some truth with that piece of the mirror, but they didn't have the full picture, the full truth. And Mormonism was all the broken parts of the mirror brought back together to be this perfect mirror once again. This idea that Mormonism has the whole truth and everybody else just has parts of it at most has been a core part of the church's teaching since it was founded. In Joseph Smith history, we learn that God allegedly called all other churches an abomination. Brigham Young, in the Journal of Discourses, said, "Every spirit that does not confess that God has sent Joseph Smith and revealed the everlasting gospel to and through him is of Antichrist." Malala, you're fucked. Sorry about that. Brigham Young said a lot of other really cool stuff, but another quote I have here from him, also in the Journal of Discourses, he said, "It was said to Joseph Smith, the prophet, according to your faith and the teachings of your elders, nobody will be saved but you, Mormons. Now, Mr. Smith, will all be damned but the Mormons?" Joseph Smith replied, "Yes, and most of them, unless they repent and do better." Apostle Orson Pratt was once asked, what will be the consequence if people do not embrace the Book of Mormon as a divine revelation? And he said, "They will be destroyed from the land and sent down to hell like all other generations who have rejected a divine message." Joseph Fielding Smith, another prophet, said, "Saints are the best people and in many ways superior to any other people." I respect his honesty with that one. It's always more annoying when people try to hide their egos under like a faux humility, you know? I'd rather they just put it out there. It feels more authentic at least. Prophet Gordon B. Hinckley said, "Our message is so imperative when you stop to think about the salvation, the eternal salvation of the world, rests upon the shoulders of this church. When all is said and done, if the world is going to be saved, we have to do it. There is no escaping from that. No other people in the history of the world have received the kind of mandate that we have received. We are responsible for all who have lived upon the earth, and that involves our missionary work. And we are going to be responsible for all who will yet live upon the earth." Doesn't really line up with how few shits the church gives about climate change, but Gordon B. Hinckley was just a cute little PR guy, so whatever. So these quotes, by no means an exhaustive list, really show the way that Latter-day Saints are taught to think about the world and their place in it, and how they should view themselves in comparison to other people. You know, prophets, leaders are constantly invoking the idea that they are superior to other people. And again, I can say from personal experience that it is nearly impossible not to have your ego inflate when you believe that you and members of your church are in sole possession of the greatest truths this life has to offer. Like, others may have parts of the truth, but only Mormonism has the whole truth. I think just believing that on its own, regardless of your character, is a superiority complex, you know what I mean? Another way this is taken up a notch is with Mormon marriages, aka eternal marriages, aka a woman covenanting to obey her husband as he obeys God. I think they've changed that now, but when I got married in 2015, that was how it was. Eternal marriage is one of the core parts of Mormon doctrine, and it's heralded within the church as the most important thing a person can do in their lifetime. The reason that God put us here on this earth. You can't even get to heaven unless you have entered into an eternal marriage, which today just means a regular monogamous Mormon marriage, but the church used to teach that you could only get to the celestial kingdom if you're a polygamist. Brigham Young taught that monogamy was a system of prostitution and whoredom, and he taught that Adam was a polygamist, and he also said, the only men who become gods, even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy. He also promised people that if they didn't accept polygamy, they would be damned. Those sentiments were echoed by tons of other church leaders, all of them, like Apostle Orson Pratt, who said, all men who oppose the revelation which God has given in relation to polygamy will find themselves in darkness. The Spirit of God will withdraw from them the very moment of their opposition to that principle until they will finally go down to hell and be damned if they do not repent. If you do not become as dark as midnight, there is no truth in Mormonism. Such a fun religion. Just good vibes all the time. We could honestly spend 1,200 hours going through disturbing quotes from endless church leaders about polygamy, but that's not the focus of this video, so I'll leave links in the description box if you are interested in doing some further reading there. So back to the present day, Latter-day Saints believe that if you're not married in a Mormon temple, you are married for this life only, while they are married for this life and also eternity on top of that. Despite the fact that most Mormon marriages are entered into at extremely early stages of knowing the other person, like a year would be seen as kind of a long pre-engagement dating period in Mormonism. These Mormon marriages are seen as superior and more legitimate than non-Mormon marriages because they're going to last forever. Even when non-Mormon marriages are entered into after like 10 years of a couple knowing and loving each other on such a deep level, doesn't matter, it's not going to last forever. So I've been with my boyfriend for 5 years now, and the depth of love we have for each other is so... it's like worlds apart from the depth of love I had with my ex-husband when we got married. Like, we didn't really know each other in any meaningful way because the church didn't equip us to know each other in any meaningful way. Everything was very much tick these boxes, God wants you to be married, blah, blah, blah. But you can't know what you don't know, and youth can make you just so convinced that you know more than you do. It's so embarrassing. I know there obviously are Mormon marriages that are really lovely and authentic and worthy of admiration, and I love that. I love love. But I think that at a systemic level, Mormon marriages can often feel kind of depressing for me because I don't think the church properly equips people to be in healthy, non-codependent marriages where each person supports and celebrates the other's autonomy and personal growth. I think it's more, a lot of the time, about people squashing themselves into these roles and fulfilling the roles they're supposed to fulfill at the expense of their true needs and often their own personal growth. Me and Tana have talked a lot on this channel about the danger of making relationships conform to roles rather than allowing for evolution, even if that means stepping out of certain roles. Sorry if you heard that sound. Certain roles that you previously took on, because it ignores how dynamic we are as humans, how we're ever evolving, and how we can't always count on ourselves or two people to grow in the exact same directions forever. I think Mormon marriage teachings can lend themselves to a lot of people feeling stuck in relationships that aren't serving their highest, happiest selves, and feeling a lot of guilt about that, and not knowing how to move forward. This is a story you hear a lot in the Mormon ex-Mormon community. We also need to bring up the fact that Mormonism's teachings about marriage are sexist, and there are a lot of unfulfilled women in the LDS church because of that. I remember when I was in the Institute class that you take before getting married, the manual for the class openly condemned birth control, like had all these quotes from prophets and apostles condemning it, and taught openly that a woman's primary purpose in life is to have babies regardless of economic circumstances or any circumstances. Even back then I was like, no. But that's how recently these kinds of ideas have been taught. And I mean, that's just one. There's so many sexist teachings in Mormonism. Like the fact that up until very recently in the temple, men would covenant to obey God and women would covenant to obey their husbands. Like that's been Mormonism for the majority of its existence. And if you go back to polygamous times, holy shit, I mean, it's just like overwhelming how consent was just not even a concept, how authoritarian and patriarchal marriages were, how women were just not seen as equals, even, you know, like I feel like modern Mormonism kind of pays lip service to the idea that men and women are equal, they just play different roles. Now, they weren't doing that back when they were doing polygamy. They were like, I'm gonna marry that 14-year-old because the salvation of her family depends on it. So yeah, I see a lot of reasons to not put Mormon marriages on a pedestal, and yet Heavenly Father has given us the law of eternal marriage so we can become like him. Isn't it weird to have your salvation depend on a romantic relationship like that? It's funny how readily I accepted that when I converted to Mormonism, because I'd still grown up in a culture that centered romantic love as the most important thing in the world, the thing that will save you from all your struggles and insecurities and essentially yourself. Just a lot to unpack. Now, as we know, Mormonism's approach to marriage isn't only problematic because of the superiority complex that drives the engine, it's also deeply homophobic. Mormonism doesn't allow gay marriage in its temples. It believes that it is a counterfeit lifestyle, and you can be excommunicated for marrying a person of the same sex. You can be excommunicated for a lot less, which is not giving aspirational for me personally. The church views gay marriage and people being in same-sex relationships as a moral issue, in that they believe it is immoral to do those things. Thinking about this, I started thinking about how easy it is to believe someone is immoral in Mormonism. Like, members are always judging other members for not being moral enough. Everyone's got their own sort of code that other people aren't living up to. Because Mormonism promotes such a rigid yet arbitrary view of morality. And that makes me think, like, what kind of life is it to constantly be viewing the people around you as immoral? I think because I left the church when I was 22, my prefrontal cortex still hadn't fully developed. I didn't sort of experience the full extent of this. But I just imagine, like, now as an adult being Mormon still, it's just tough to, like, live in the world and be around people if you're judging them all the time. Like, it's not pleasant. It's not a nice way to live, to always feel like you're superior to others. Like, it genuinely feels bad. Although saying that, you know, having a superiority complex is like a coping mechanism. You know, it's like if we don't feel good enough, we are more likely to adopt, you know, these ideas of grandiosity and superiority. So put a pin in that. I do feel like most people I come into contact with in this life are nice and trying their best. And I don't look at them through the lens of how worthy are they. But I remember when I did do that and how much it warped my thinking and, as I said, just made life worse. Lying is considered wrong in Mormonism, highlighted by the fact that to get a temple recommend, you have to tell the bishop that you are honest in your dealings with your fellow men. Even though Mormon prophets and apostles are notorious liars and have even encouraged members to lie for the Lord before, like when they were trying to hide polygamy from the government. Joseph Smith himself lied to basically the whole church constantly and was always like, no, I'm not practicing polygamy. How could you accuse me of that? Clearly I only have one wife, and he had like 37 at the time. He also lied to Emma a bunch. She did not give consent for all his marriages to girls as young as 14, despite that being part of God's commandments about polygamy in D&C 132. It was just all a shit show. He didn't even have the sealing power. Didn't even have claimed to have had the sealing power when he first realistically had sex with a 16-year-old girl in a barn. The idea that Mormonism is the most important organization on the earth and that Latter-day Saints are doing the most important work in the world has made it also really hard for people to criticize leaders, with some leaders teaching that it's not okay to criticize the Lord's anointed, even if the criticisms are true, which obviously, you know, not being able to criticize your church leaders, if that's not a setup for a superiority complex. There's also this phenomenon where members can sort of lightly criticize or roast or question Mormonism or its leaders, but if someone who's not part of the in-group does it, it's not okay, it's not valid, you're led by the devil. That's kind of a sort of normal group dynamics thing, but disturbing when it's a multi-billion-dollar organization involved with enormous power rather than like your family. My ideas about spirituality now involve trying to widen my circle of compassion till it includes everyone, because I think we're all the products of our genetics and experiences, and I think we're much better equipped to solve the big problems our world faces when we can see the humanity in everyone, rather than being delusional and thinking that our judgment and punishment alone can stop people from doing harmful things. In Mormonism, obviously, things are very black and white. You know, you do any of these things, sort of, you know, there's a spectrum of severity of what's considered a sin, but, you know, you do any of these things and that's like lowered your worthiness slightly, you know. And when I was in Mormonism, it was always constantly about like trying to advance your worthiness, advance how well you were doing, advance how much you were being devoted to the Lord, you know, that you're never doing good enough, which doesn't leave a lot of room for like, I wonder why that person did that harmful thing. Oh, they had a really brutal childhood and their brain was programmed at a young age to react with like a fight or flight anger whenever like situations came up that we can't understand. You know, there's just so much there. And it is true, like, we can't judge anyone because we don't know shit. Like, as I said, we're all the products of our genetics and experiences. We've all been programmed in certain ways, and like, who are we to claim that we would do anything different in anyone else's situation? And what does that even mean? Don't want to get into the free will discussion here, but highly recommend Sam Harris's work on free will if you're interested. I think empathy is one of the most important skills we can learn, and research does show that it is a learned skill that we can all get better at, which is fun. I found that during my time in Mormonism, empathy was not really taught or valued in a healthy way. There were definitely some teachings that you could maybe label empathetic, but I tended to find that they had the flavor of pity more than actual compassion, and they were often laced with this idea that we need to feel sorry for these poor people because they don't have the gospel like we do, and their happiness is not as full as us, and their marriages aren't even eternal, and they don't get to spend 3 hours a week listening to people's dads give the same talk they've been listening to for 12 years. I don't know. I think it's really hard, or even impossible, to have empathy for people that you judge. And while Mormonism does pay lip service to not judging others, it doesn't really hold up as authentic when you look at how the church and its culture operates. And by the way, labeling things church culture is not the past that believers often seem to think it is. Culture doesn't exist in a vacuum. Culture is informed by the doctrine and teachings. And this is a church led by modern revelation, so there should be plenty of opportunities to correct unhealthy cultural problems. And yet, judging people is just rampant among members and leaders in Mormonism, whichever way you sort of spin that judgment. And entire groups of people are talked about with really dehumanizing language because LDS people believe their understanding of truth is so superior that they're capable of accurately characterizing people who are different from them, even if they don't know anything about them. This is kind of one of the hallmarks of a lack of empathy, is grouping people together so much, being so lost in your categorizations that you don't actually, again, see the humanity of someone or see like the intricate events that have happened in their life that have made them the way that they are. And there's every human being is like a web of experiences and feelings and misfortune and fortune and oppression and oppressing, and there's just so much there for every single person. But when there's this tendency in high demand religions like Mormonism to just, you lump someone into a group and then you think you understand them. And we do this with all kinds of things in life, right? We categorize it and then we think, oh, we've understood it. This is why the Buddha did a sermon allegedly where he held up a flower, and the whole point of the sermon was like, really look at this flower instead of just seeing it and being like, oh, pink flower. Evil, oppressive people like Hitler, I hate to bring up Hitler, I'm just an idiot who doesn't know enough about history to use other examples. They will spend a lot of time and effort trying to get people to just lump people in with a group that is being collectively demonized so that they don't have to actually look at the reality of individual people, so they can just sort of, because it's a lot easier to dehumanize people when they are just kind of part of this group, this label, rather than like, just sort of being face to face with another individual, like learning about them. It's a lot harder to dehumanize someone like that. It's a lot easier if you can just get them to be lumped in with a group, because you can poison the well so that people, whenever they encounter anyone that fits into that group label, they can immediately think, oh, well, that's what that is, Boyd K. Packer once said, "Remember, when you see the bitter apostate, you do not see only an absence of light, you see also the presence of darkness. Do not spread disease germs." Such a charmer. While church leaders have kind of softened in how they might talk about, say, the gays and the apostates, dehumanization is still really present in their talks and their teachings. They'll constantly tell members that people who leave the church do so because they're lazy or sinful or have various defects of character. They'll favor their own self-soothing stories about why people leave the church, for example, over the truth. And to me, not being willing or able to understand another person's lived experience because you're too absorbed in your own narratives is the biggest block to empathy. It's not empathy if your compassion for a person relies on you believing that they're inferior to you in some way and so therefore you should pity them. And it's certainly not empathy if you're not even willing to listen to how they feel, which is a common thing that ex-Mormons have experienced with believers. Like, they don't want to know why they had a horrifyingly painful, traumatic faith crisis and decided to leave the church. They just are more comfortable with assigning these narratives to them, so then they can sort of switch off and they don't have to think about it anymore. It's a lot harder to have to confront someone's reality. So that's why we see all high demand religions and cults demonizing people who leave, putting them into this group, apostates, whatever they're calling it, and just totally poisoning the well. For years and years and years, members are taught, their whole lives, as long as they're in these groups, that anyone who leaves is doing so because of some kind of weakness of character or something they did wrong. There's no legitimate reason to ever leave. I mean, this is just like the bread and butter of all Heidemann religions and cults, because they run on the groupthink, they run on the us versus them, they run on people feeling that they wouldn't be able to survive without the organization because they are psychologically dependent on it because they've been conditioned to be. When I was brainstorming for this video, I also thought about how many times girls at BYU schools have been, not just girls, have been punished for being sexually assaulted because they were in a boy's room with him alone, or, you know, broke some rule that made them less deserving of empathy. Judging others is going to run rampant like this in an organization that teaches such arbitrary, narrow views of what morality looks like and what it means to live a worthy life. The concept of worthiness generally is just really bad for empathy, especially when combined with prosperity gospel. You know, this idea that we're blessed when we're righteous, consider the happy and blessed state of those who keep the commandments of God. Because there's always a way you can chalk up someone's misfortune and pain to their own failures. And by falsely believing that someone else is responsible for their own pain in life, you don't have to actually confront it and feel it and reckon with it. Mormonism kind of numbs you to a lot of valuable emotions because it favors this myopic, juvenile, limited view of reality that doesn't require you to confront the really tough feelings in life, honestly. So I asked Instagram what teachings in Mormonism fed their superiority complexes the most, because I feel like all ex-Mormons will say, yeah, I had a superiority complex when I was in Mormonism. And a lot of them are quite similar and relatable, I think, for most of us, and relevant to this discussion, so I just wanted to talk about a few of them. So I asked what quotes or teachings fed your Mormon superiority complex the most. The first person said that America is the promised land. Yeah, I haven't even touched on in this video the fact that American nationalism is kind of the cult within the cult of like, you know, not only is our religion the best one in the world, we're also in the country that's the best one in the world, because for some reason our psyches are so juvenile that we have to be the best one of everything for some reason. I don't get the appeal of that. I'm like, why you gotta... I like to believe that there's many other countries that are better. That gives me hope, you know. It feels good to believe that there are like other places that are doing things better than the place where I live. I don't really understand this need to constantly affirm to yourself, this is the best it could be, because isn't that kind of like antithetical to hope? I don't know. A lot of people brought up the persecution complex. This is definitely sort of the twin of the Mormon superiority complex, is the Mormon persecution complex, which is not surprising because, as a lot of spiritual teachers that I like have taught, the two extremes of the ego are superiority and inferiority, you know, believing that we are special and better than others in all these ways, but also that we're like uniquely persecuted or uniquely terrible. And Mormons don't do the uniquely terrible one, but you know, it's that you often hear, I mean, we get it on our videos a lot. Believers will come and comment and they'll be like, no other church is persecuted the way we are. No other religion gets as much hate as Mormonism does. And it's like, a lot to unpack about that. I mean, first of all, Mormonism is obviously such a new religion that makes such outlandish claims that are so easily disproved, but also it's kind of like the internet culture that has allowed members to learn this information is still so relatively new that it is like having a big moment, and kind of has been for like the last 10, 20 years, and I'm sure we'll keep having a moment. Obviously, there are religions that are not as high demand as Mormonism, so I feel like those religions are less likely to get kind of the same energy of backlash from people who leave, because it wasn't as cult-like, so it wasn't like, oh shit, I was completely psychologically dependent on this organization and taught that if I ever left, my whole life would go to shit, and people who leave are terrible and it's the worst thing you can do, and now I've just discovered the truth, and that all of these claims that I based my life on are completely disprovable. Sorry that I said disprovable. I should not have said that. That was wrong for me to do. You know, if you kind of grow up as like a relaxed Catholic where it's kind of just like a side piece in your life, you're probably not going to want to devote or need to devote the same amount of energy to leaving it as ex-Mormons will. And it's perfectly healthy for ex-Mormons to do that. Like, you got to process the emotions, you got to deconstruct. It's useful to do it with a community. A lot of people only have online communities. So much that can be said about that. But also, it's just not true that Mormonism is the most persecuted religion. You know, the Catholic Church had a huge, I mean, remember Spotlight? You know, that movie won an Oscar, didn't it? Like, there's been Scientology, there's been so many religions that, you know, have a lot of people speaking up very loudly about the ways it's harming people. And again, as I said, it's perfectly healthy for former members of a harmful organization to speak out about the harm that group did. I think that's a valuable part of healing, often a necessary part of healing. So yeah, even if Mormons are the most persecuted of any church, which I don't think you can measure anyway. I don't know what research would point to that, but like even if that was true, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just like, yeah, maybe people are uniquely harrowed by a church being founded by a pedophile. I mean, there's a few churches that have been founded by pedophiles, to be fair, but you get what I'm saying. I'm gonna move on. Oh yeah. The whole like, you as a seminary student know more than the Pope, or like the 12-year-old boy has more power in his little finger than the Pope. That's a fun one. Yeah, purity culture. I mean, all kind of like Mormon ideas about morality, I feel like can play into this superiority complex. But yeah, I mean, believing that engaging in a perfectly normal, healthy, consensual act that everyone does, or, you know, humans are wired to do, is sinful, doesn't bode well for you in terms of how much empathy and non-judgment you have towards most of the world, because, you know, most people are not waiting to have sex until marriage. Yeah, a lot of people commented mentioning the "we're a chosen generation" teachings. Feels like they've dialed those back a bit. Can anyone confirm that? Because remember the whole, you know, a hush will come over heaven one day when they learn that you were alive in 2011. It's like, okay. Yeah, a lot of people said that they were taught to only be friends with those who share your same high moral standards, which, you know, it's not like we're talking about only be friends with kids who don't do drugs and flunk school. It's like, don't be friends with... I mean, my boyfriend had an aunt that smoked. An aunt who didn't even live with them. And apparently certain parents would be like weird about their kids coming over and playing with him because, you know, might catch the disease germs. The one true church, yeah, again, like that sentiment alone is the superiority complex in a nutshell, isn't it? Like, the one true church, okay. Someone else mentioned the teaching to be in the world but not of the world, because obviously, you know, Mormons are better than people who are in the world, the regular world. You know, there's kind of a way I could see that teaching being repurposed for good. Like, it is kind of good to not get too wrapped up in sort of like systems and cultural ideologies, but it's not really like taught like that in Mormonism. Oh yeah, did anyone else hear that Heavenly Father saved his strongest spirits to send when the world was most wicked? And the fact that they were alive at this time meant that they were the most righteous in the premortal realm. There's been so many problematic teachings throughout Mormon history of this kind of like pre-destiny idea. I'm phrasing that badly, but you know, the idea that Black people were less righteous in the premortal realm, for example, was openly taught as doctrine by multiple prophets, multiple apostles. Like, that was just standard fare. Also, Black people weren't allowed to marry white members. How's that for a superiority complex, you know? Oh my god, yeah, just the idea, someone mentioned the idea that we knew the true history of the Americas. Yeah, I can't get over this one. The fact that the church is centered around a white man's ethnocentric bullshit fantasy story about Native American history, completely ignoring everything the science and actual Native American history says. Talk about superiority complex, you know, like what this white boy said, what this white man said 200 years ago, most of which is just demonstrably false at this point. Like, you know, the whole book of scripture is demonstrably false. The book of Abraham, like, we can translate the papyri now and we know it had nothing to do with anything he wrote about. Like, just time and time again, the stuff he taught is just been completely debunked. And yet the superiority complex is so strong that it's like, you know, you're just supposed to like keep believing what these white guys have taught for all these years because like you had a really special feeling in your heart and you were programmed into it at such a young age that you can't conceive of a reality outside of it. Language like the elect, chosen people, I mean, talk about a red flag for a cult.
Quick question, why in this video do I keep saying talk about a blank constantly, though I never normally say that? It's humiliating.
Yeah, modesty is another way that Mormon superiority complexes get perpetuated. I remember at BYU Idaho, if there's a percentage of students, at least half, I was among them a lot of the time, where if someone else was wearing an immodest outfit, I judged their worthiness, aka their like, almost like their value as a human being. I mean, maybe that sounds a bit intense, but you know, it's like they don't love God as much as I do. Being born in the covenant, grim. Another big teaching I think we need to bring up is that people who do not have the gospel, aka Mormonism, can experience happiness. They can experience it. But they can't experience a true deep joy like we Mormons can. You know, it's different. Again, it's kind of like the part of the truth, but not the full truth. This is just absurd because I don't think Mormons are any happier than, you know, anyone else. Happiness is such a difficult thing to measure, like as a researcher, but I mean, you can look at Mormon antidepressant use rates, suicide rates in highly populated Mormon areas. Like, it doesn't hold up, you know. And this is in a population that is overwhelmingly white and middle class, which, you know, certainly doesn't hurt. Oh, someone mentioned anti-swearing rhetoric, and they said, it made me afraid of people who swore and proud of never swearing. And I think this is an interesting one because I've heard this is one of the scariest things to me. I've heard Mormon children, like more than one, I would say probably 2 or 3, make, like, directly, and then I've obviously heard a bunch of indirect stories as well online and stuff, but Mormon children will often get this complex. Like, I met a kid, like, last year, and she was, I think, about 12, and just so openly judging people who swore. Like, she was telling me about this girl in her class, and she was like, yeah, but she's not a good person. And I was like, oh, how come? Is she not nice to people? And she was like, no, she's really friendly, but she swears. And I was like, okay. I don't think that's good for kids. I don't think it's good for them to start seeing themselves as superior to other kids because they don't swear. It's developmentally appropriate for kids to, like, experiment with swearing. Ooh, it's like, I would say the damage done by swearing is in the judging of the swearing much more than it's in the words themselves. You know, it's like, yeah, learn appropriate social context for different languages, for different language, sure. But I've also heard tons of horror stories of, like, teachers in Utah Valley and places who have talked about how, you know, the entire class was judging a girl because she had, like, a sleeve like this on her dress, and it breaks my heart. It's like, clearly it's being taught at such a systemic level if all these kids are growing up learning, and then they're turning into, it makes sense, like, right, you see the progression, and, like, maybe as you get older you get a bit better at masking your judgment, but it's still there, you know. You're still, I've been in, is there a bishopric meeting I was in once? I don't remember what, like, ward council I was on, but I remember, like, a big theme of it was kind of just, like, gossiping about who might be breaking certain commandments, like having a boy over too late or drinking a iced coffee. Or it's just ridiculous. I'm tired of my own voice. I'd love to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments what your kind of experiences were with, you know, did you feel superior to others growing up? I feel like most Mormons did. Maybe you didn't. What teaching sort of stood out to you the most and, like, burrowed in there and affected how you would see other people? I think this is going to be a topic that becomes increasingly relevant just because I feel like the world is very intolerant now of people just having open God complexes, you know, and being like, our marriages are eternal and yours are all shit. Like, the world, that's not going to hold up for long, you know. Like, today's young people don't grow up in an environment that's going to, like, allow for them to swallow that so easily, you know. And I feel like there's more, you know, there's a million cult docs out now. There's just so much more awareness of the signs of high demand religions and cults being really damaging, and superiority complexes are, like, you know, they're right up there. They're kind of the thing that drives the whole machine. Thank you for listening to me. If you want to help us to make more videos like this, you can support us on Patreon, where we also have bonus content that's really fun. The more money we have coming in through Patreon, the more time we can devote to making videos like this. I think sometimes, those of you who have followed us for a while, like, you might notice that sometimes it feels like we do quite, not like lazy concepts, kind of, you know. For this video I sort of did scripting and researched it and, like, wanted to make sure it was all clear in my brain before, which took me about a day, but it's hard to devote that time to that when, I mean, like, YouTube ad revenue is just shit. unless we go viral anytime soon, like, it's just not, we can't earn a living from it. So the more money we make from Patreon, the more we can not panic at the idea of, like, spending a day writing a video. Thank you to those of you who are patrons already. We really, really appreciate it. Love the community over there. And I hope you're all doing well. Oh, I also am a faith transitions coach. I have been for the last 3 years. Sorry, I'm supposed to start promoting myself more. Supposed to, as in I want to. Yeah, I've been a certified life coach for the last 2.5, 3 years, and I've been helping people navigate faith transitions through coaching. So if you're interested in that, my website is samanthashelleycoaching.com. It'll be linked below. It's really fulfilling for me to, you know, just kind of help people trust themselves again. Like I'm not a life coach that's like telling people what to do. I don't think that's appropriate for a life coach, but I help them figure out what they want and need, and what they might need to deconstruct, and what beliefs might still be holding them back that they maybe haven't like fully reckoned with yet. You know, there's a lot involved in a deconstruction process from a high demand religion. There's a lot involved in a faith crisis. There's a lot of like kind of learning how to connect with yourself again, to trust yourself again, and to love yourself again, or for the first time actually. And so yeah, I'm just there as sort of like a guide and a friend and a sounding board. And yeah, thank you all for watching. I'm happy you were here. Bye.